So yeah, as you can see here, I'm going to be talking about the antecedents, the behaviors, and the consequences associated with academic shame. And so I guess one of the things is like, why am I interested in what I do? And primarily, I would say in graduate school, I was trained as a cognitive psychologist in graduate school, but I don't know that I fit neatly into that box anymore. I kind of like, I don't know if I'm an educational psychologist or a cognitive psychologist or a social psychologist. It's more of like kind of a mixture of these different areas because I feel like, and then I also dabble a little bit in psycholinguistics, which I'm not going to talk about today. We'll save that for the fall. But yeah, I kind of just have, and involved in a lot of different areas. But one of the things that I am kind of passionate about, I guess, is education, right? So in terms of like educational psychology and what psychological processes are involved in learning. And I just wanted to, just as an example, why is this important, broadly speaking? I don't know if you guys are familiar with this National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's kind of the nation's report card. It comes out every 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and it's basically just, hey, as a nation, where are we in terms of these different subjects, right? And so I'm not going to go through all of these exhaustive things, but I mean, if you look here at math, I mean, clearly there's been a 9-point dip in standardized math scores since COVID. But you can see even really only 5 points up from 1973. And again, this is kind of scary. This is 271 out of 500 in terms of standardized math ability, right? So as a country, we're not doing all that well in math, and reading's not all that much better, right? I mean, there's been a dip in reading ability since 2020, and again, no significant, I mean, from 1971 until 2023, we haven't improved at all as a nation in terms of reading ability. And so I guess my point is, whatever it is we're doing, I don't really think it's working, right? I mean, so I feel like we need, we throw more money at education than per capita than any other country or any other country on the planet. So it's clearly not a money issue, right? Money is not going to fix the downward trend or the plateau in terms of learning. And so I don't really believe in silver bullets necessarily, but what I do think that we do need to acknowledge, and what I do feel can maybe play a role in this downward trend, is just to start to acknowledge the role that emotions can have in the classroom. Really throughout the history of educational psychology, or more broadly, just education research in general, researchers have neglected the affective side of student learning, or the emotional side of student learning. And I like this quote here from this recent paper by Reinhard Peckert. He says that the classroom is an emotional place, right? Students experience things like fear and anger and shame and boredom, enjoyment, hope, pride. I mean, we've all probably experienced this. I mean, especially kind of the running joke, I've been looking at research on emotions for a long time. You're going to experience everything when you work on your dissertation, essentially. You're going to be angry and hopeful and disappointed and all these sort of things, right? And so clearly it's beyond the scope to talk about all different emotions and how those play a role in the learning process. And really in my line of research, I'm focused and interested in just on one particular emotion, this idea of academic shame, right? When we talk about academic shame, talking about just shame that's occurring in an academic setting, right? That's pretty self-explanatory. This isn't necessarily the definition I use for shame, but I like this because it's so sort of visceral and it really gives you an idea of what we're talking about with shame. It says, it's a raging cold sweat dread about things we deem vile, yet which you have done, said, thought, desired, been, or still are. Shame is a punch your forehead cocktail of emotion that simmers and swells inside of us and refuses to be talked away. Shame is the free fall whiplash shock of believing that we have broken rules and caused harm. We are unacceptable and deserving of punishment, right? So if you're not familiar with shame, that's a pretty good description. But there's a lot to unpack there, so I don't think it's necessarily a good sort of operational definition if you're going to try to have an empirical study of shame. So I kind of like this idea. I mean, sort of kind of boiling it down, we could say, well, shame occurs when an individual blames a globally flawed self for a negative outcome, right? So it's a global negative self-evaluation, believing that it's due to some sort of global personal flaw. In other words, feelings of inadequacy and self-blame. And the reason I think, outside of even education, right, I do feel that, as we'll see, shame plays a part in the learning process. But why else should we study shame, right? It's been shown to be strongly associated with mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, eating disorders, low self-esteem, feelings of worthlessness, negative impacts on academic performance. So shame plays a role across many different areas. And so one thing, I will circle back to this later on, but I think a really important distinction that needs to be made for those that have kind of worked in my lab or are working in my lab, you're tired of me saying this, but there's a lot of misconceptions about shame and guilt, right? You know, I guess you can even go to the gold standard of psychology, even though I disagree with that, but you can say, oh, Sigmund Freud, right? Sigmund Freud is the gold standard of psychology. He didn't even know the difference between shame and guilt. I mean, a lot of the stuff that he talked about in terms of neurosis seems to be more talking about shame, even though he called it guilt. And you can look at a lot of these manuals and papers, and they're using shame and guilt interchangeably. One of the figureheads of shame research, June Tangney at George Mason University, did a study a long time ago and asked a bunch of undergraduates what they feel the difference is between shame and guilt. And I think her favorite definition was like, shame is feeling guilty, guilt is feeling shameful, right? So even these undergraduates don't know the difference between shame and guilt. But simply put, shame is I am bad, guilt is I did something bad. That's the biggest difference, right? So she talks about these as being more moral emotions and how guilt is the moral emotion of choice. And again, I'll say more about this moving forward, but I just wanted to make sure we knew the difference that when I'm talking about shame, I'm not talking about guilt. Those are two distinct affective experiences. So one thing that I am going to talk about time and time again, because it plays a big role in a lot of our previous research, is this idea of shame proneness. So when I talk about shame proneness, unlike what's called state shame, which is more in the moment shame, right? We can talk about shame proneness or this disposition to shame, right? Shame proneness describes a chronic vulnerability to feelings of inadequacy and unworthiness. And like shame or state shame, shame proneness also is associated with a lot of negative outcomes. It's associated with depression, lack of empathy, a tendency to blame others, expressions of anger and hostility, right? So again, you've got this idea of state shame, which is in the moment shame, right? I'm feeling shameful right now. But also this idea of shame proneness, this disposition to shame, it's basically you're just bringing baggage to the situation, right? Whenever you experience something, you're more likely to jump to the conclusion that it's probably my fault and something globally deficient about who I am as a person. All right, so when we talk about the antecedents of shame, again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I don't want to bore people, but I think it's important to talk about a theoretical framework, right? I mean, what's out there, what's already been done in terms of shame, because you know, I always tell students, you know, when you get to writing a discussion section on a paper or something like that, I mean, there is room for speculation, right? I mean, you can say a little bit, well, I think this happened because of this, but it can't be entirely speculation. It can't be entirely intuition. You need to ground that research in some sort of theory to help explain why you think you found what you found, right? So having said that, I kind of tend to use two different theories that are out there that have been done on shame. One is what's referred to as Pecker's control value theory. Again, I'm not going to go through all this. That would just bore everyone to death, right? But the idea is that we talk about appraisals of what he says control and value, and these are the antecedents of what he calls achievement emotions. So when we talk about achievement emotions, we're just talking about emotions that are related to achievement activities, whether it be studying or work or sports, and then also the outcomes that are associated with those achievement emotions. So whether you succeed or fail. That's, I mean, again, I'm grossly oversimplifying. You know, there's lots of papers out there, but for this discussion, it's fine, right? So I'm not going to go through all of these different components. I really just want to say, look, let's just talk about, you know, at its bare bones, what are we talking about with the control value theory? So I figured, I know this is like really far-fetched, but for the control value theory, let's focus on the control of value, right? Let's not worry about all this other stuff that's going on because it can get really messy. I guess let me say this. One of the reasons I do like this control value theory, this is one of the reasons he developed this theory starting back in the early 1980s. Side note, I guess, this is really embarrassing. So I've given 3 or 4 conference presentations over the last 5 years where this has sort of come up, but I was at two conferences, I guess, 2 separate occasions, because I didn't remember the first time. But there was this guy in the audience who was always like, hey, you know, this is really interesting. Have you thought about the control value theory? And I'm like, well, I'm aware of it, but no, never used it, and he was like, I really think you should use it. It's really relevant to what you're doing. And it was Reinhard Beckman, right? And so he's like in the audience saying, hey, I think you should be using my theory. And then I'm like, no, I don't. And I just felt real stupid after the fact. So more recently, I have been incorporating this because it is honestly, it is a good fit for what I do. And I don't want that to happen for a third time. But so all we're talking about here is when we say, he basically says that all of these achievement emotions are based on the interaction between control and theory. But as I was saying, one of the things I like about this theory is, I would say, a criticism of psychology as a psychologist is there's a lot of different theories out there, and it would be nice if we could streamline and sort of have a theory that encompasses a lot of these different things rather than having all these different separate theories out there. And so that's what he did. He basically came up with this control value theory. It's not completely new, but he's trying to have this umbrella of where we can fit all of these other pre-existing theories under the umbrella of one theory. And so when you talk about control, as you would imagine, it's just how much control do we feel we have over a situation, right? And this can encompass a lot of different things. Situational demands, your self-efficacy, your competency, what do you attribute the success or failure to, all these things, right? But it all falls under this idea of control. How much control do we feel we have over the situation? And then how much do we value it, right? I mean, do we feel like it's important or not, right? And so when you talk about, do I have control? Do I not? Is this important? Is it not? Just the interaction of those things basically leads to these different achievement emotions. And he talks about prospective achievement emotions, which are based on things that might happen in the future. So maybe if I don't feel like I have a lot of control and something's very important, like if I have to take the GRE and I don't feel like I have any control over the GRE and I feel like this is really important to get into graduate school, I might feel like hopelessness or something like that, right? Or you can have retrospective, so based on things that have already happened, I might be like, well, that was a really important test and I failed it, and it's because I'm an idiot, and that, I might feel shame, right? Or you can have these activity emotions based on what you're doing in the moment, so I might be bored, right? But the point is, it's all sort of based on these interactions between how much control you feel like you have and how important the task is. And obviously, I'm not going to test you over this, but he's done a lot of research and found all these positive correlations and negative correlations with different emotions based on the control and the value. Another theory that I sort of like, because it is relevant, more relevant depending on the experiment that I'm doing. Again, I'm going to give you a really simplified version of this. This is known as Tracy and Robbins' process theory of self-conscious emotions, right? Which would include guilt, shame, pride, embarrassment. Those are sort of the main self-conscious emotions. And again, just a really simple overview. It basically says, look, when something happens out there in the world, right, and whether I succeed or fail, it's going to cause me to turn inward. I'm going to start self-reflecting, self-awareness. And that self-reflection, self-awareness is going to activate what are called self-representations, right? And I'm going to have either a current self-representation, which is how do I view myself now, versus a future self-representation, who is it that I would like to be in the future? And then I ask myself, is there some sort of congruency between who I am now and who I want to be in the future based on that event that just happened, right? And so if that event, if I do really well on a test and it closes the gap between current self-representations and future self-representations, you like what I did there, right? That took a lot of time. So if it closes the gap between who I am now and who I want to be in the future, I'm going to feel pride. But obviously, if it increases the distance between who I am now and who I want to be, I'm going to feel either shame or guilt, and that's going to be based on what do I attribute that failure to. Do I attribute it to something internal? If so, I'm going to feel shame. If I attribute it to something external, I'm going to feel guilt, right? So that's really all the Tracy and Robbins, in essence, right? Okay, so taking all of that, what are some things that we've done in my lab? So again, I'm not talking about all these studies, but I do want to give you an idea of what we're doing over in the psychology building over in Ezel. So one of the first studies that we did was essentially say, okay, in what way does shame impact learning, or does shame impact learning? And so you can see this is a paper that we just got published last year in Education Science. But the reason I kind of got interested in this is, I don't know, I'm not going to go down this whole, tangent of talking about my academic history. But those who are sort of, have talked with me extensively, like, I didn't consider myself to be a good student growing up. I mean, in high school, I wasn't really interested in studying. I was, I played various sports, as you would, not football, as you can imagine. I know you're shocked, right? I wasn't a football player, but I did, soccer and track and cross country and all that. And I was just more interested in that than I was in school. And then even once I graduated, if I'm being honest, I was like, you know what, college is what you're supposed to do after high school, so I guess I'll just go to college. And I still didn't know what I wanted to do when I got to college. Interesting side note, I was a history major at first. I took a couple of history classes, no offense to history professors, but I was like, I don't want to do this for a living, right? This is interesting, but I don't want to do it for a living. And since we're on the topic, I saw the movie Good Will Hunting. It came out, and I saw that, and I was like, oh, that's the job I want. That's not what I do at all. But right, I saw Robin Williams, and I was like, that's the perfect job, and let's major in psychology. So all of that to say, like, I have these memories of like getting tests back in high school or something like that, and very quickly kind of flipping it over and just kind of sliding it under a notebook because everybody's looking around to see what everybody else made. And it just wasn't a good feeling, right? I don't know if it was embarrassment or guilt or shame, but I can tell you it wasn't good, right? I mean, I didn't feel good when I didn't do well on these tests. And so it just kind of got me thinking of like, what kind of impact does that have? Like if I get that test score and I feel horrible, and then the teacher or the professor jumps into new material, am I even able to retain any of that information? Or are these feelings that I'm having just overtaking any ability to retain new information, right? So that kind of is what got me thinking about this. So to answer this question, we actually conducted, what we're going to talk about first are two separate studies. And again, I'm going through these really quickly, so don't feel like we're going to camp out for too long. But to answer this question, we had two separate studies where we actually had 264 participants for these two studies. So we had a decent sample size. And during the study, one study, we actually asked them to learn about physics. And so we actually sort of made this in-house video. These are two students that used to work in the lab years ago. But essentially, if anybody, Dr. Stephen Barber over in physics and engineering, so he collaborated on this project and he wrote this script for us about stuff that he taught in his sort of introductory physics class. And so using that script and all this information that he gave us, we basically made this in-house video on physics. That was one study, so we were asking them to learn physics. And in a second study, we asked them to learn about the circulatory system, right? So they were learning about physics, they were learning about the circulatory system in two separate studies. And in both studies, participants were randomly assigned to either an experimental or a control group. And again, just to keep this very surface level, in the experimental group, we induced shame in our participants. Goes without saying, but we did get IRB approval, right? So we induced shame in the lab. And the way we did that, again, it's nothing overly complicated because research has shown that feelings of shame are associated with feelings of shock and surprise. What we did, this is really mean if I'm being honest, but we brought them into the lab, and essentially for those that were in the shame induction condition, we said, okay, we're going to have you take an aptitude test, which was really just ACT practice problems that we got from the ACT website. And we said, hey, this shouldn't be that hard for you. This is an aptitude test. And they would take the aptitude test, and then a text box would pop up when they hit submit. And we basically say, you did horrible. Everybody else did so great, right? So we basically told them, we gave them false feedback, and we told them that they just failed it miserably and that everybody else that's taken the test did really well. So that was the shame induction, right? And the control people, they submitted the test and it just said, okay, you're done with this portion. Please let the experimenter know you're ready to proceed. Oh, I should mention in the experimental, they also had to report their score out loud to the experimenter, right? So that was kind of painful. So that was the shame manipulation. And so here's the thing, having told you that, the first result shouldn't be all that surprising. So across the board, everybody in the experimental condition had significantly higher levels of state shame, right? So basically being told, hey, you failed the test, everybody else did great, now you have to tell your score to the experimenter, everybody felt terrible, right? But I think maybe the more interesting narrative that I like here is look who scored the highest, right? So we also did these tests of individual differences, and we found that if you came into the lab with shame-prone baggage, right? In other words, you're just on a daily basis, you're probably experiencing shame because you have high shame proneness. Whenever something happens, you're really ready to say, I'm at fault, right? So these people who came into the lab, went through the shame manipulation, who also had shame proneness, unsurprisingly, right? I mean, as you would expect, those people had the highest levels of state shame, right? when you go through the shame induction and you have high shame proneness. This was with the physics, but you also saw pretty much the exact same pattern in circulatory system, right? Totally different study, went through the same induction, but again, those with a high proneness to shame who also went through the shame induction have the highest levels of shame. So again, I want you to keep in mind, high shame proneness, experimental, because that was when we measure state shame, right? How much shame are you feeling right now? The question, though, is how does this impact learning, right? And so what we found, those two groups, right? Those two groups learned less than everybody else, right? So when you look at the control condition, maybe not a surprise here, didn't really matter if they were low shame prone or high shame prone because they didn't get any false feedback. They would just say, hey, you're done, time to move on. And so those people, they did learn, I mean, either in both low and high shame prone, they increased from about 18% from pre-test to post-test, right? But what you see here is those, again, experimental condition, high shame prone, they only learned about 17%, right? And then this is actually pretty interesting here. Low shame prone experimental, right? So these are the people that we cause to feel shameful. But what I think is going on here is these people aren't accustomed to feeling shame, right? They're not shame-prone individuals. So all of a sudden they're being told, hey, you did horrible on this test. Everybody else did great. Now you've got to tell your score to the experimenter. And so I think what's going on here is for those individuals, they're having to prove to themselves and the experimenter that I'm better than this, right? There's no way I failed this test. You know, I've got, because what we did is we did this induction before we introduced them to the physics or the circulatory system content because we wanted to see what impact the state shame had on the subsequent learning of information, right? And so for this group, when we turned them loose learning physics or circulatory system, they just didn't learn a whole, I mean, there is learning taking place, don't get me wrong, but it's not near as much as other people, right? Low shame prone experimental increased by about 27% from pre-test to post-test. That's a lot of learning that's taking place, right? So I would argue that it's kind of throwing them out of this state of equilibrium into disequilibrium, and then they're kind of having to lock in and say, okay, like what happened there? Now I'm supposed to learn physics or circulatory system. I really need to try hard, right? Okay, so having said that, what we then wanted to do is, okay, we found that shame is bad for learning, right? That's kind of a takeaway message. But we wanted to see, can we create a shame resilience intervention that alleviates the negative impact of shame, right? So what can we do to help people overcome a sense of shame? And so we had 42 undergraduate students that participated in this study of testing out this new shame resilience intervention. And broadly speaking, when we talk about shame resilience, right, we're just talking about the ability to recognize, confront, effectively manage feelings of shame, coping strategies to deal with shame in a healthy manner, fostering a sense of self-worth, maintaining connections with others, capacity to understand the source of shame, express emotions, concern. Like, there's a lot going on, right? I didn't try to address every single aspect of shame resilience. What I focused on in this particular resilience intervention is what's called, it's a fancy way of saying, it's an attributional retraining. In other words, we tried to tell people what the difference between shame and guilt is. Are you internalizing failures? Are you externalizing failures? If you're internalizing them, you probably shouldn't, right? You failed the test. You feel bad. Whether you're feeling guilty or shameful, you feel bad, right? But you didn't fail the test because you're an idiot, essentially, right? You probably failed the test because you were on your phone too much, you weren't paying attention, you didn't study, you didn't take notes. All of that is external, right? So you should probably be feeling guilty rather than shameful. So we were basically just trying to teach people the difference between shame and guilt and the difference between internal and external attributions. And we gave them a test on differentiating guilt and shame just to see how much they were learning from the intervention. And I actually collaborated with Dr. Turner at Florida State University on this project, and she and I sort of wrote the script for this shame resilience intervention. But essentially, one thing we found was when you look at pre-test to post-test, this is a significant increase. This was only out of 10. This was just more of like an in-house guilt shame test that I developed. And so everyone, after watching the intervention, they did great. Like, they know the difference. This is a significant increase. So everybody's learning the difference between shame and guilt. So that's good. We also gave them a retrospective questionnaire asking them to rate the intervention on a lot of different things. And again, I'm not going to go through all of them, only to say when you talk about, identifying and recognizing and distinguishing shame and feeling comfortable with sharing shame. As you can see, from pre to post, so pre-intervention to post-intervention, significant increases across the board with huge effect sizes, right? So number one, they're learning about shame and guilt, which is good, and then they're feeling much more confident in their ability to identify and recognize and distinguish and share when they're feeling shame, right? So all that's good. So right now I'm looking at this and I'm feeling really good. Like this is probably a really effective intervention. But before I actually, and we also did some individual difference questionnaires, and we found, this was the first time I looked at this, but in addition to the effectiveness of the intervention, we found this significant positive affiliation or association, I should say, between shame proneness and feelings of imposter phenomenon, right? And so essentially, you guys are probably familiar with this on some level, but imposter phenomenon is just like, hey, I didn't succeed because I'm smart or hardworking. I succeeded because I was in the right place at the right time, right? In other words, they're always externalizing their successes. And so if you think about it, if you just take a step back and look at this, mentally, this is a horrible place to be, right? So these are the people that whenever they fail, they're internalizing their failures because they're shame prone. And when they succeed, they're externalizing their successes, right? So they're taking credit for the failures and they're giving credit somewhere else for the successes, right? That's not a good place to be, like I said, mentally. But so that really got me thinking, okay, let's continue to look at these individual differences moving forward. So before I actually tested to see whether or not we saw measurable changes in behavior as a result of this intervention, based on what I told you with our shame induction, I thought maybe we should try to find a slightly more ethical way to induce shame. It's not that we were doing anything unethical, more ethical. I'm going to use heavy air quotes because we got IRB approval, right? We did our job. But I don't know, as I'm getting older, I guess, my kids are getting older, I started thinking, would I want my kids to go through this? And the answer was no. And so I thought, if I don't want my kids to do this, I don't think I should make other people's kids go through this, right? And so I thought, well, let's see if there's just a better way to where we're not adding to the situation. I didn't want to add to the stress or the distress that people were experiencing just to study shame, right? So we kind of did this conceptual replication of a study that was published back in 2022. But essentially what we did in this study was to try to get the elicitation of shame using a naturally, organically occurring methodology, right? Rather than saying, hey, you're stupid and everybody else is so smart, right? Is there a more natural way we can get people to feel shame so that we can study it scientifically, but without adding to the situation, right? So what we did, again, just using sort of a conceptual replication, is they came into the lab, again, did some individual difference questionnaires, but all they were asked to do is, hey, write for 15 minutes about a time in which you felt shameful, right? We didn't use the word shame because that has baggage and connotation, but we had instructions, and it was like, times you felt unworthy or unloved or whatever because of something you did or something somebody said to you or whatever. But it was basically write for 15 minutes about a time you felt shameful, or just write about what you did in the last 24 hours, right? And so what we found, which was contrary to what they found back in 22, was when you look at just writing about a shame experience versus writing about what they did in the last 24 hours, we didn't find any significant differences in levels of state shame. Yeah, mathematically speaking, the experimental group did have slightly higher shame. Again, this is out of a 7-point scale, all these experiential shame scales are. But so that's not a significant difference. But again, we found previously that shame proneness and these individual differences seem to play an important role. And so I thought, well, we got to keep looking at the individual differences because we got to uncover there's probably something going on. And sure enough, right? Look at what's going on here. So for the people who wrote about their last 24 hours, I mean, out of a 7-point scale, that's still higher than you would expect, I suppose. Why are they feeling sort of that much shame just writing about? Literally, the instructions said, you can even talk about what type of toothpaste you used this morning, right? I don't know why they're feeling any shame as a result of what toothpaste they use. But I think more interestingly, again, you see this interaction, right? So from a clinical point of view, I can't stress the importance of this because what we're seeing here is that the people who wrote about a shameful experience, who also are high in shame proneness, are feeling significantly worse about themselves in that moment compared to the same people who are writing about a shameful experience but don't have a high proneness to shame. And so I would argue that is that not, to a large degree, what psychotherapy is having people recall things that have happened to them. And so what this is saying is those who are high in shame proneness, when they're recalling a shameful experience, they're arguably feeling just as bad as they did when that event actually happened. But for those who have a low proneness to shame, they're talking about something that was really bad, and they're able to sort of like disassociate almost with that event, and they don't feel bad at all, really, when they think back to that event, right? So I thought that was really fascinating. And then again, with more individual differences, for a second time, significant association between imposter phenomenon and shame proneness. So again, we replicated that previous finding, so it wasn't just a fluke. But then we also saw some other associations that I actually will address later on. Not surprisingly, positive association between shame proneness and how much state shame you're experiencing, how much imposter phenomenon you experience, and how much state shame. So again, you're seeing these associations between state shame, shame proneness, and imposter phenomenon time and time again. And so the last study that I want to talk about is, okay, now that we see that shame is bad for learning, we develop this intervention. It does seem to be good, at least the perception of it from the students is good. And they're learning about shame and guilt, but does it actually lead to lower levels of shame when the rubber hits the road, right? Does it actually make a difference? And so similarly to the first study where we tested the effectiveness of the intervention, we did it again, but we use that written shame induction, right? So these are people that everybody went through this shame induction where they wrote about shame. The only difference was some people watched the intervention before writing about shame, and some people watched the video after they wrote about shame, so that everybody got the intervention in case it was effective, right? And again, what we see here, that first graph I showed, these are just some example items from this retrospective questionnaire. But again, how important was it for you to identify shame? How confident are you in your ability to recognize shame? How confident are you in your ability to help one of your classmates? If you experience, how comfortable will you be sharing? So you can see the pre and post intervention, those means, and then everything significant at the 0.001 level. And again, the effect sizes are huge, right? So again, people do seem to think that this intervention is worthwhile, and you see a lot of these increases from pre-test to post-test. But again, the question is, are there measurable differences in state shame? Does it actually work? And again, interestingly, yes, but only for low shame-prone individuals, right? So again, this is everybody went through the written shame induction protocol. So what you see here, the control, these are people who wrote about shame without being exposed to the intervention. So you would imagine their state shame levels would be pretty high. They're writing about something, a time in which they felt really terrible about themselves, and there's nothing we did to try to alleviate how bad they were going to feel, right? But what was surprising, the experimental people, these are the ones that got the intervention before writing about shame. So you would expect them to feel better, right? Maybe it's some sort of buffer in terms of buffering them from feeling bad. But those in the experimental are feeling just as bad as those who didn't get any intervention whatsoever, right? So for those with high shame proneness, this intervention didn't have any impact. They felt bad, right, regardless of whether they got this intervention or not. But those who are low shame prone, who wrote about shame but got the intervention before writing about shame, this is significantly lower than that. So their levels of state shame are significantly lower if they watch the shame video before writing about shame, right? So it does seem that this intervention does seem to be doing something, but it's not helping those who have a high shame prone tendency. So it's not a one size fits all. Yeah, so again, kind of focusing in on that difference there. And then just quickly, again, I'm running a little out of time, sort of. I'm going to have some time for discussion maybe, but lots of associations, again, because I found the importance of these individual differences. Shame proneness and imposter phenomenon again. Here's one I haven't talked about, though, just really quickly. I thought about, well, we're only looking at shame proneness. We're looking at imposter phenomenon. Let's just go ahead and throw perfectionism in there, right? Because I feel like, not that there's like three sides to a coin, but I feel like shame proneness, imposter phenomenon, and perfectionism are all sort of the same side of whatever, right? They're all cousins to one another. And I thought, well, let's just see what's going on here. And so we found primarily and this is kind of interesting, when in terms of perfectionism, we didn't see anything with self-oriented perfectionism, right? So it's not these standards that they place on themselves. That wasn't significantly correlated with anything. It wasn't significantly correlated with what's called other-oriented perfectionism, which is the standards that I hold you to. What we found time and time again was lots of associations with what's referred to as socially prescribed perfectionism. And this is the pressure to meet certain standards or expectations that are imposed by external sources, right? So whether it be your family, society, peers, or even the media. So basically, you feel like you have to be perfect based on what you think others are expecting from you, right? And so people with socially prescribed perfectionism feel like they have to be perfect in the eyes of others to be accepted or valued. So when you think of it like that, this is not surprising, right? This correlation makes sense because socially prescribed perfectionism can make someone feel like they're constantly being judged, leading to feelings of inadequacy or unworthiness if they don't meet these external standards, right? So we saw socially prescribed perfectionism with shame proneness, with imposter phenomenon, and state shame, right? And then again, state shame and imposter phenomenon, and lastly, state shame and shame proneness, right? So what does this all mean, right? So only about a 45-minute discussion, pretty good, right? So I guess what does this all look like? Well, I guess I would say number one, shame proneness unsurprisingly seems to exacerbate negative impacts of in the moment shame, right? So yeah, in the moment shame is probably not good, but I would say it's kind of like my running joke, which I hate and love at the same time. If anybody asks me any question, oh, you're a psychologist, what does psychology say about that? I'm going to say, it depends, right? Psychology doesn't have the answer, really a straight answer to anything, right? So I would say, is shame bad? I would say it depends, right? State shame by itself, probably not the worst, but when you couple state shame with shame proneness, that seems to be the perfect storm. Then couple that with perfectionism and imposter phenomenon, then you're starting to look at a perfect storm of bad mental health, right? So shame proneness exacerbates negative impacts, which can impact the recall of shame experiences and how that makes you feel, knowledge acquisition. But then also one thing I came across is shame seems to be negatively related to feelings of belongingness and formation of school community. And that is related to self-regulation, sense of autonomy, internalization and student adherence to group norms, intrinsic motivation, engagement, positive attitudes towards school and self, social competence, and academic achievement, right? So again, shame hurts belongingness in a sense of community. And if you don't have a sense of belongingness in a sense of community, it's going to impact all of these things. So I would argue, if administration is listening, right, I feel like we need to start acknowledging shame, especially in the classroom, but maybe even more broadly, because I feel like shame is going to impact student success rates and retention rates, right? If people are experiencing shame, they're not feeling a sense of community, they're not feeling a sense of belongingness, and that's going to cause people to drop out because they're going to feel like this isn't the school for me, right? I don't feel like I fit in here. And so, taken all together, I would say that shame, perfectionism, and imposter phenomenon are all interrelated psychological constructs that reinforce each other. Shout out to Kennedy for making this for me. I gave her information and said, give me some cool looking figure, right? But what I think is going on, when you look at all these associations, I basically say what's going on here, what I think is going on is you've got these people who are perfectionists, right? They're setting these impossible standards. They're not meeting the standards. They're feeling shameful for not meeting the standards, which makes them feel like they don't belong, which is imposter phenomenon, which means as a coping mechanism, they're setting even higher standards so that they can prove to themselves and others, and then they're not meeting those, and then they're feeling shameful, and then they're feeling imposter phenomenon, and then they're, as a coping mechanism, they're setting even higher standards, right? So it's just this cycle that people can't get out of, unfortunately. And so take it, when I kind of like this quote here by Teddy Roosevelt. It basically says, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there's no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions? Who spends himself in a worthy cause? Who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement? And who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. So I would say if we don't, with this shame resilience, if we don't teach people to get up after they fall, right? They're going to spend their whole lives afraid of falling, and they're not even going to get into the arena, right? Because they're afraid of feeling shameful, right? And so I just want to say thanks to, I couldn't even fit everybody's picture on this, like with Dr. Turner and some of her graduate students, Juhi Kim and Wenting Song, and then these are, I have over 30 undergraduate research assistants. Let's all point out Gabe's hair, right? So again, these are just some of the pictures that I was able to grab off Pipeline for the undergraduate research assistants that have helped in my lab. So thanks to you guys who have contributed. So, all right, that's all I got. Any questions or discussion?